Hello, and thank you for joining us for the first episode of the SLW Institute's Analytics How To webinar series. This episode will examine how to make and use portfolio analytics, patent landscapes, and patent watching and surveillance reports. This is the first episode in a 5-part series. A recording of the webinar and the slides will be made available to all registrants. Feel free to enter any questions using the Q&A feature in the Zoom menu. We invite you to follow us on LinkedIn to see news about other upcoming webinars. And with that, I'll turn things over to our moderator.
Hey, thank you, Michelle. Hey, welcome everybody for attending our episode 1 of this series. The intent of this series is to try to get some nuts and bolts of analytics. We see a lot of webinars, or at least a lot of presentations by vendors of analytics tools, and we see tons of interesting features to use. But a lot of times we're left a little bit short when it comes to practical implementation of those things for a lawyer or somebody that's an analytics specialty in a corporation or law firm. So what we want to do with this webinar series is try to bring it down a little bit to practical nuts and bolts of how you do things. So today we're lucky to have a group of people that have done a ton of analytics type of projects in the past and with deep experience in the space. We're starting out with Janelle Callis from Schwegman Firm, one of our principals, and Janelle routinely does analytics analysis type of projects for her clients, and she's been doing it for a long time and is very experienced, and she's got very good practical information to share with us. Andre Murray, who works with a lot of very leading corporations, especially in California, and Andre uses these tools extensively on a strategic basis, probably as much or more than any lawyer in the United States. So I think Andre can give us some really great practical insights. We're lucky to have Milena Higgins with us today too. She's Chief of Data Analytics at the Schwegman Firm. Milena's got a very deep background in IP. She's worked in patent litigation, and she's also done other projects, analytics projects for other leading IP firms, and also she was at Black Hills for a time. Tim Chrisman, also very strategic mind, has a lot of insights that he can share. Also working with a lot of our top companies that we represent, clients, and doing a lot of analytics work. And last but not least, Robbie Stans. Robbie is our analytics specialist at the firm, and Robbie can work with virtually any analytics tool and help anybody crank out reports in a very short form. So Robbie's a great resource, and he's the guy that you go to when you need something done. So with that, let's flip to the next slide. So I mean, we're going to look at 3 things today. We're going to talk about portfolio analytics, technology-based patent landscapes or analytics, and we're going to talk about patent watching and surveillance for a little bit at the end. Now, our focus today is on what I call machine-generated analytics. These are not hand-curated analytics. These are analytics that you can punch in some parameters into one of the analytics machines that are out there and get some great results very quickly at low cost. So today is really our focus is on how to use these tools in a practical way and generate excellent analytics data that you can use for strategic purposes. So if we go to the next slide, the tools that we use routinely at the firm or have used routinely for the essentially analytics engines, Acclaim IP, which is a product of Anaqua, Total Patent One, Patent Buddy, which is a product of Black Hills IP, and Anography, a system that CPA slash Clarivate owns and licenses. And then we also use Patent Bots and Patent 300 dashboard from a leading IP firm purveyor. So what we're going to do, go to the next slide, please. We're going to kind of first I'm going to take you through quickly through some slides that just set up what portfolio analytics are, and then talk about technology landscape analytics. But before I get into either one of them, they're both essentially the same analytics types reports, but one's focused on looking at like a company's portfolio. What have they got in the portfolio? What classes are they in, et cetera? How many patents? What's their trends? The other technology landscape is looking at a technology area as a core search criteria and looking at all the companies, comparing them with one another. So let's go ahead with portfolio analytics, just an overview, and then we'll get into some actual slides to show you the actual analytics and get some commentary. So portfolio analytics are based on, basically information available in any, patent and business databases. I think most of the analytics companies take their information for these systems, out of the public databases that are essentially anybody can access, but they pull them in, they curate them, they clean them up. They also pull in data from business sources, relationships between corporations and their subsidiaries. They pull that in, they pull in other business data, and then they aggregate it all together and voila, give you some great reports. So a portfolio really is pretty much a key patents that are essentially grouped around, in this example, what we're talking about, really typically a company, but it can be really any set of patents. But we kind of like think a portfolio belongs to a corporation or an institution, and technology landscape is sort of a whole bunch of different companies. So that's, they're going to give us some insight into various different parameters. We'll get into that more as we get going along. So next slide, please. So why do you want to do this? Well, for a really low cost, and if you know what you're doing, if you got the right person in the back that room that can do that, and I don't mean back room in any kind of derogatory way, but Robbie Stands, for example, you feed him some simple information a lot of times, and voila, within minutes or hours, you can have some really interesting analytics to look at. And so they let you see lots of interesting things, and we're going to get into that again in a little bit further. So let's go to the next slide. Next slide, please. Okay. So, process and cost. I mean, for these machine generated analytics reports, the main cost is paying the license fees for these tools, and they're reasonable given the power of the tools. I think the typical cost for a law firm to license one of these tools is in the $50,000 a year range, or could be less or more. And the process that we're going to talk about today is really defining what you want out of the tool in some simple terms, giving it to your tool expert, Robbie Stands, and very short period of time can get results with these machine generated analytics. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So the technology landscapes are the exact same thing I just discussed, except we're going to look at, a technology area and kind of look at each company's position in that area. You can go to the next slide. And this is, again, essentially this is kind of repetitive of what we just talked about. So I'm going to go through these next few slides pretty quickly. But the technology is broken down by all the same parameters: landscape, ownership, time of filing, grant, countries covered, value and importance of the patents. So you can compare different companies' portfolios in a given technology area. Next slide. Again, same value proposition, lots of really great competitive insight in a very short period of time. Next slide. And again, similar kind of a cost proposition. The biggest cost in these is the tool cost, and figuring out what you want the tool to do for you is the main cost. Next slide. So before I hand it over now to Milena and to Robbie to kind of walk through the kind of information you need to give to Robbie or to whoever's going to use the tool to generate reports, I just want to say like a couple of high-level observations of these tools. Obviously, these types of the reports you're going to get are of a nature that you really only need to look at them episodically. You know, you're not going to look at a portfolio analytics report every day because nothing's going to change except for trivial amounts of information. So these reports typically would be looked at some point in time where a client has a need. Maybe they need to acquire some patents or they're getting into a new area where they need some information about what decisions to make for budgeting or acquisitions at some critical point in time. And then the tools aren't used for quite a long time. They just sit on the shelf and waiting for the next time to be used. Or maybe you look periodically once every 6 months or a year, but typically you're looking at data in these things. It doesn't change very much. So once you've taken a look at it, you kind of absorb it. Now it's not really doing anything for you. And I think that's what makes using these tools sometimes a little bit difficult for certain customers of ours or clients of ours, because, you know, you buy the tool, you may only dust it off and look at it once every, month. It's not really worth the investment and the time it takes to learn how to use it. Therefore, put Schwegman on speed dial if you need to use these tools. Be happy to help you. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Robbie and to Milena to kind of walk through the input parameters for either either a portfolio or landscape report. Essentially, very similar. Go ahead, guys.
Thank you, Steve.
Go for it, Milena.
All right. So this slide just gives you an idea of the kind of inputs that you would need when doing either one of these types of reports. So for portfolio analytics, most typically you would need an assignee or a list of assignees if there's a group of companies owned by a larger entity. So that would be the input you would start with. And then if you needed to narrow it down by, for example, countries or specific status of patents, whether you wanted just the active patents or all of them, regardless of status, you could also limit it by time. And of course, a whole bunch of other criteria, but these are exemplars. And then for the landscape analytics, typically you start with a technology area. So you would start with either a classification of technologies or keywords or specific companies of interest, and that sort of seeds your search. And again, similarly to the previous one, you could also narrow it by countries of interest or status of the application, specific dates, or other parameters that are important to your particular search. Next slide, please. So now that we've talked about the inputs, let's look at some example outputs. This is a very simple pie chart that if you did one of these kind of searches, the analytics tool could give you very quickly an output like this of your top patenting by country. So you'd get a very quick glance at what the portfolio looks like. Next slide, please. Another example would be to look at who are the top assignees in a technology area, for example. So here's a sample chart that you could get, again, literally with a click of a button once you did your search to show you the top assignees. You could do a similar chart for top inventors or top agents that would look very close to this one. Next.
Milena, just before you move on from that slide to the assignee one.
Yeah.
I just want to, I think one feature that we find kind of useful is that a lot of these tools, Steve mentioned they plug in kind of business information and, business structures. So, some of the tools will have interesting fields such as, ultimate, assignee. So you can look at ask it to surface all patents, held at the highest level of a corporate hierarchy, or even within the subsidiaries. And some of these tools also make actually, they do what they call a guessed or an estimated or assignee based on, looking at priority information, or even inventors, if they're like, oh, here's a cluster of inventors, and we know they historically have all worked for one company. Because sometimes the assignee information may not be public. So these tools can be helpful in sometimes uncovering, assets that are not on the face owned by a certain assignee, for example.
Yeah, that's right. Very, very good.
That can kind of give you early insight into what some companies are doing that otherwise wouldn't show up in a typical report.
Yeah, and they also do a great job of normalization of data, or assignee data, which is always a perennial, it's a challenge. Like the name's spelled differently, and so they do a good job of that.
Yeah, on the landscape side of things, we do a lot of starting out with a big picture, a broad search, and I would provide the client with something like this, and then from there we would try to hone in on, okay, I like this as news, I want to look at this one, and then continue to just kind of narrow in on the exact technology and competitors we're looking at.
So if I may interject one other thing, and I don't think we're going to talk about this specifically, so I really didn't mention it, but it's also interesting to look at what patents have been transferred between companies using these tools, so that you can identify, a competitor maybe is buying assets from another company, and then that gives you some competitive insight into what they're concerned about. And IBM, there being the biggest bar there in the graph, they're one of the biggest patent stores you can ever go to. For most of you in the industry know that. Go ahead, Milena.
Perfect. Let's move on to the next slide, and Rob, I'll let you take these.
Sure. So this is very straightforward. We're just looking at date charting here, and this can give you a really clear picture of whether your own portfolio, where the growth is, how many filings per year you're doing. If you want to look at priority compared to filing, we can produce both, of course. Whether you're looking at original filings or continuations, this can also be used to identify whether a competitor is filing more than you and catching up to them.
Yeah. Yeah, and Robert, I mean, I think you've worked, I've worked on a number of projects with this, where we've actually kind of taken the data information and done some interesting benchmarking for our clients. We have some clients who are asking the question, another competitor that they might be benchmarking against when they were our age, at when they were 5 years old or 10 years old. What did the profile of their patent portfolio look like? As opposed to, the raw, year number. So we've done some charts where we've done, the age of the company, year 1 through 20, and then benchmarked different companies so they can kind of see how they're doing. And you can even get more sophisticated there by, depending on the data that's available, looking at number of patents per dollar of market valuation. If R&D data is available for particular years, you can also start to do some interesting benchmarking graphs that our clients like to see, just so that they can figure out, are they being too aggressive, or not aggressive enough in pursuing the patents relative to some other metrics and relative to age. Yeah, and then I think another, with the filing date and the priority date, you can also see whether a particular company is heavily mining their existing, filings. So we'll sometimes see companies transition from, doing original filings more to a very much more aggressive continuation policy, and it's it's interesting to see that shift using this data information that we've got here.
Could I just, this is Tim, could I just amplify that a bit too and say that generally, I find the charts that are temporal in nature like this, that show a timeline, to be very interesting. This one has the heading portfolio filings per year, but keep in mind that the corpus of different patents that are driving this chart could be whatever search criteria you've established. So that could be by a specific set of assignees or a specific assignee. It could be by classification. And so it really gives you an idea how the filing intensity varies by time. And as Andre mentioned, if you have access to other data, it can give you a proxy for R&D intensity. The only other observation that I wanted to make very quickly was that, one question that might come up is there's an 18-month publication lag for new patent filings, generally by operation of international agreement. But that doesn't mean that everything takes 18 months to surface. For example, for things that are filings that key off of existing priority, so continuation filings, for example. So, I think that looking at these with the dates, you might sometimes see a signature where the filings appear to tail off in the last couple of years, but that might be an artifact of publication delay, and these can still provide very useful metrics.
Thank you, Tim.
Hey, so there's a question that came in, Milena. Sorry to interrupt you. And maybe Robbie can answer this because he's probably the one that's the biggest, our top guru. Robbie, the question is, can you perform date charting for various assignees shown side by side in the bar graph? And then can you refine by technology?
Sure. So this specific chart comes from a claim IP, and as they provide it, you cannot do side by side analysis, but I mean, we do that all the time. So that would just be the next step up. And again, this is just the entry level of what can be just click of a button after identification of the portfolio. But all the data is also exportable in there. So I can take that data and create our own charting, which we do just as much as we do these. So.
Say, Milena, I noticed, thank you. I noticed you were going to actually answer that too. So
we
interrupt you. I just figured Robbie was.
No problem, Steve. We both saw it at the same time. Let me just add to that. There is some capability in a claim IP to put in 2 search queries in one bar chart. So you could potentially, if I'm understanding this person's question, you could put in one assignee in query 1 and another assignee in query 2, and then you would see the 2 bars for each year next to each other, and that might get at what you're trying to understand. That would be kind of the closest to a side-by-side comparison that I'm aware of.
Yeah, and certainly you can constrain it by technology if you want to. That's
Yes.
easy.
Right. And a lot of these you can also kind of break down as far as status, and there's a few other barriers. You can do multiple levels of charting.
Just for clarification too, when we say constrain it by technology, that could either be by search query or by classification, for example. So there's different ways that you could cleave that.
So you could put in keyword constraints, logic, and constrain technology by that, or you can do it by class or whatever. Yep.
That actually gets to one other point that I wanted to make, which is that the quality of these tools is somewhat dependent on the time that's spent up front in intelligently establishing the queries. So one of the bullets in a previous slide was the inputs to this, sort of your starting point, are tell us the assignee or tell us a group of assignees or something else. But one thing that I found to be useful is doing some initial work with test queries and sort of getting buy-in, with some test searches just to pressure test the queries for the future automated reporting, just as an exercise. And I think it's really worth some upfront investment. This is, of course, if you're searching in broad classifications, some clients have very, very specific competitors that that they might be looking at, or other things where that, it's not as complex. But I do think it's worth taking some time to really carefully craft the queries.
That's a great point, Tim. The pressure testing I find is really important, because if you can show with a test query that you are seeing the assignees, for example, that you expect, then you've structured your query in the correct way. And if you're not seeing what you expect, you go and you modify it to the point where the client's happy. So that's a really great practice tip.
Yeah, I think it's a very similar exercise to what you'd engage in for just more generic landscape searching or FTO work. It's really great if somebody can provide you with some test cases and say, come up with a query that reliably, flags these individual matters, because then I know that you're getting the sorts of things that I'm interested in.
Exactly. All right, let's move on to the next slide, please. So here's an example of a bar chart you can get by top classification. So if you were searching, let's say a competitor's portfolio, you could see which classifications they're filing in. And you can do the similar kind of narrowing of these as we already mentioned with the other chart. So let's keep moving.
Yeah, Melina, I think I just wanted to. So I think on the CPC, it is kind of interesting in that they typically use a different code. Well, they kind of flag different CPC codes. So one particular patent may have multiple CPC codes associated with it, and that's fairly typical if the technology straddles multiple technology buckets, if you will. But they do designate what they call an inventive CPC, which is where they anticipate that the inventive feature is, and even that can be two. You can have two or three quote inventive CPCs, and then they also have these what they call additional codes, which are more might be perhaps something in the dependent claims, or based on something in the specification. So sometimes a bit of a challenge here is that you are dealing, with a graph like this, we can only show one CPC code, and there may have actually been, two or three CPC codes allocated to a particular, patent. So very often we'll maybe do a multi-dimensional CPC one where it's ones that are in this class and that class, and you can use that also obviously to kind of refine your searching. So I just wanted to add that before we moved on.
Yes.
Could I? I'm
Sorry.
sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I'll also add quickly that this may not mean a lot to you with just the actual lettering and numbering of the actual CPC or IPC class, but I'll usually include also a table right next to the graph of the definition or the title of the actual class that you're looking at, and that'll really help.
I would just add that that CPC for those that I'm assuming that the majority of our audience is already quite sophisticated, but the USPTO moved away from its own internal classification scheme to the CPC scheme, which I believe is derived from what was the IPC previously, and it's now jointly curated by the PTO and the EPO, I believe. And so this has provided some commonality, and the subclasses get quite granular. And as Andre says, you can develop queries that are very specific. The other thing that I wanted to mention about this particular plot is this just shows total numbers of patents versus classification within whatever your corpus of patents are that form the portfolio that this analysis is being run on. You can also do time series plots for classifications or combinations of classifications, which is really interesting because it gives you an idea what the filing intensity is over time in particular technical domains. So that's all I had.
So
I actually think that that's the next slide here, Tim.
and by the way, there's a question that came in. I think we should just try to address some of these as they come up. So someone has commented, the analysis is only as good as the data. And then how many patent families are you typically analyzing? And do you manually review for relevance prior to creating analysis? And I can take a little bit of a shot at answering that and let other people comment. But I think what you're getting at is that a lot of times with these broad brush type of analytics reports, you're pulling in a lot of patents that maybe aren't that specifically relevant to a particular technology that your company might be making, because the classification systems are not that accurate around, actual patents that are going to be infringed by, a particular company. So I think that, I would make the point that these reports are more broad brush reports, although you can pinpoint them a little bit if you get, as Tim just mentioned, into the more minute classifications. These are not the type of report that you're going to get actionable freedom to operate information out of. You'll get input to a freedom to operate study from these reports because you can find patents that you need to look at, but you're not going to have, it's not going to tell you whether or not you're clear to enter a space. Anybody else want to comment on that?
And I'd just like to say, I would agree that with the identification being the most important part of this whole thing. Is if you're not starting out correctly, you're obviously not going to get the data you want to see. And I will also add that I've been working in these databases for about 7 or 8 years at least, with experience in them, and they are continually getting better, and the data is becoming more and more trustworthy as we continue here.
Yeah,
I think
later in our series, we're going to talk about manually curating reports where we would be looking at, specific patents and patent families with manual eyeballs on review. But
I guess all I would add to that, Steve, is that, I think generally this type of automated reporting is the idea is that with a little bit of upfront investment in the queries, you can get a tool that's very low cost to generate and iterate and review. And I think of it as sort of being like a tripwire kind of a thing to answer basic questions like, are we investing in areas that are the right areas to invest in? Is there a competitor that we weren't aware of that suddenly surfaced, or is the filing pattern for either us or the competitor changed, in some way that's actionable over time? Those types of questions. I mean, does the rest of the panel agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's right, Tim. I mean, it depends on the purpose. I mean, a lot of the time we're kind of the client's more just, well, we're interested in a kind of a high level view, and if there are 1 or 2 patents that are included in a report that are not relevant, but we're looking at 1,000, it's not going to be any meaningful error there. And I think the main thing with this machine generated one is well, you want reproducibility, where you can again take a snapshot at this quarter and then reproduce another snapshot using the same criteria next quarter. So I think for that type of analysis, I think you want to kind of limit manual input. But again, if it is a deeper dive, and as Steve mentioned, we'll get into that in a future webinar. Yes, we'd do a manual review there. I mean, I find a lot of our clients, and particularly the patent departments and the larger clients, really need to communicate within the organization, what they're doing, and communicate to the executives, what does our portfolio look like, and how are we stacking up against the competitors, and what's our strategy, and for them, we need to be able to generate a report quickly at the same report each quarter, for example, and they're having these automated machine ones where we're not doing a lot of manual work. But again, it's helpful. But again, I think we will eyeball the results and just see if there's anything that looks, clearly, outside, and do we have to tweak our search parameters for that.
You made one observation that I just really want to emphasize, Andre, which is that frequently the audience for this is not necessarily patent practitioners or the legal department in organizations, because that aligns with my experience as well. And so I think that's an important observation.
Melina, are you?
Agreed. No, I'm here. Let's keep moving. I think we have an example slide, as Robbie mentioned. This slide shows you the portfolio evolution by class. So you can see the years across the bottom, and then the different classification codes across the from top to bottom. And then you can see how each technology area is evolving, and you can use this to track whatever is important to you. So Andre or Tim, if you have any comments on this particular slide as to how your clients have used these or why this might be important.
I think this is helpful, where you'll see a particular it might be a competitor refocusing their patenting efforts from technology area A to technology area B. And that can often give you kind of a signal, maybe even ahead of any product releases or anything like that, as to where they're going. But so I think from that point of view, it's also useful. And if you're benchmarking against a competitor as well, I think this is particularly helpful to a helpful input into patent strategy. Tim,
I
did you
think
have any?
it's extremely useful in technology areas where the lifetime of a particular product might be relatively short, because you can see changes in product features in a single view.
We used something like this recently when a client was considering making an investment in a technology and wanted to know how mature the technology was. And we were able to show qualitatively that a lot of the foundational filings had occurred 2 decades in the past, and a lot of the filing activity had actually trailed off, which was, those are the types of insights that you could extract. One other thing that I can't remember if it was Andre or Rob mentioned earlier is that you can also differentiate in these reports between new filings and continuation filings. And so if there's some exploitation of existing filings going on, looking at the time evolution of that with respect to classification as well is sometimes useful, because you can see that a pivot might have occurred or some mining of existing work might be occurring, and the signature is the continuation volume.
Great. Let's move on to the next slide. Rob, do you want to talk us through?
Yeah, so this really focuses on the US data and really piggybacks on the classification just on a different level. Just to have the ability to show your art units or your competitors' art units, and then on a broader level, the tech centers. And Tim, Andre, I'll let you guys comment on that.
Yeah, I think the art unit tech center information, particularly the art unit information, has become a lot more let's put it this way, interesting to clients, particularly since 101 and became much more of a force to be reckoned with during prosecution. And the 101 rejection rate varies substantially based on art unit. It's always interesting for a client to see which what percentage of their cases are in a particular art unit, because that gives them some sense as to, how much 101, headwind they can, be expecting or are currently experiencing. A question we often get is, oh, can we shift our cases from, one art unit to another? I mean, there are, various steps you can try to steer stuff in certain directions, and that really comes down to kind of claim strategy primarily. Yeah, I think the main use for this is really just to figuring out which cases are we probably going to have a harder time in prosecution with. Janelle, Tim, I don't know if you had anything to add.
No, I totally agree with that. I think that one of the future sessions will be covering, strategic prosecution and using analytics to drive prosecution decisions in more detail. So at this point, I think that the art unit is perhaps somewhat of a proxy for examination difficulties. That's one of the most interesting aspects of it. So I don't really have anything else. I mean, obviously, art units also directly relate to particular technical emphasis areas. But I think we have other ways of getting at that information more directly via classification. So that's all I have.
Yeah, in the next slide, top examiners would be directly correlating to the art unit. And again, as Tim mentioned, we'll be diving deeper into actually the analytics of examiners and prosecution further. So.
Yeah, I think it's useful to applicants to know if they're seeing, a bunch of cases before a single examiner. That's an interesting data point. And if that examiner is, is sort of a flyer with respect to the others with respect to their allowance rate. But again, that's more in the realm of strategic prosecution that's driven by some analytic considerations.
Yeah, no, but I do think the interesting thing is, these automated tools can actually extract and generate some very interesting stats on examiners, and provide a lot of guidance to the patent practitioners. So having this information and almost having a profile for most of the examiners that you're dealing with can be really helpful to the attorneys doing doing the prosecution of of applications through the USPTO.
I strongly agree with that. I think that, even if our cases and our examination, we make the working assumption that it's an objective process, that sometimes decisions like an appeal decision versus an RCE decision, I think can be very well informed if there's a body of data available.
I see a question came in regarding ART unit correlations to examination outcomes. Specifically, the question was, what tools do you use to gain intelligence on ART unit correlation with examination outcomes? What about examiner correlation with examination outcomes? And again, I think we'll be doing a much deeper dive into that in a future webinar. But yeah, you can. There definitely is. You can see the stats that we get are for this ART unit, here are the percentage of cases allowed, and here with this examiner, and often there's a disparity. You'll find that the ART unit has perhaps a much higher or lower allowance rate than the particular examiner you're dealing with. So that can vary. Examiner outcomes can vary greatly within a particular ART unit. But stats like how effective is an interview, what are the outcomes on appeals, that type of information is particularly helpful. Oh, Steve, sorry, I think you would like to.
No, I just was dismissing it, but yeah, we will be diving into that later in upcoming episodes.
I'd say offhand, I know Acclaim IP does examiner reports, and Patent Bots also. I'm sure the other ones have them as well, but I've used those ones specifically.
Yeah, I've used them as well, and I do think that the most interesting cases are ones where you see a disparity either between the examiner and the rest of the ART unit as a cohort, or for particular prosecution decisions relative to the examiner. If there's a huge disparity between the likelihood of allowance off of appeal versus off of RCE, and then, as Andre mentioned, interview benefit.
Keep it rolling. We got next slide, please.
So here we allowed to see, this is more on a portfolio level. You can easily see forward citations, which is which companies are citing your portfolio or the portfolio that you're looking at, and backward citations, which companies are you citing the most. Tim, Andre, for a comment.
Yeah, I think we've kind of found this particularly helpful. For if we're doing due diligence on a potential acquisition of a portfolio for a client, and that trying to kind of assess the value of the the portfolio that the client may be acquiring, and seeing and particularly the kind of forward citations, which companies' patents are these patents being cited against is helpful, because particularly if there's some competitors on that list, that might be one indication of value to our client. Is like, okay, we see this in the example here, Netflix has been is citing back to this portfolio heavily, and if you're in the streaming, if you're in the streaming video field, that's a very interesting input. Yep, I don't know.
It also can help you identify competitors that you weren't aware of. I think that we've used that quite a bit for this.
Yeah, that's exactly what I would use it for, is if you're interested in, and certainly, these reports just show a handful of assignees, like the top 10 or whatever, but it's possible to generate far more extensive lists. And, you could restrict this analysis to a smaller group of patents. Like if you have a group of patents that you formed a portfolio out of that you consider to be foundational families, and you really want to know if those are being referred back to and who's doing it. So I think this sort of analysis is actually really quite interesting, and it's sort of an artifact of the candor obligation in the United States for our prosecution. The only thing that I would caution against is I think that the nature of the assignees rather than the volume of patents might be more informative. In other words, the names of the assignees rather than how much they're citing, because different clients, different companies have different practices with respect to how aggressively they cross-site, for example, and how aggressively they would search for prior art. And so that can sometimes distort the counts. But I think that the qualitative information, in other words, the assignees that are listed, that's an extremely useful thing to know.
Yeah, and another area we do use this heavily is if we for continuation practice for our clients, we'll often get asked, we want to target company XYZ, from they're perceived as a threat, and then obviously looking at this to identify which of your cases were cited against that company XYZ is a good place to start looking for where they may have exposure, and it's again, it's not strictly evidence of use, but it's a clue. And so we actually ask our attorneys when they're doing if the client's asking for continuation proposals in particular, can we target a continuation on another company? The forward citation information such as this is particularly helpful in that situation.
Next. So this slide is showing you rejections, and it really correlates to the citation side. And Tim, I think you can really talk through this one.
I really like this slide, not just because it's colorful, but because it shows you a very interesting piece of information, which is not only where there's cross citation back to your client or your portfolio's work, but where that involves the application of a patent in your portfolio or in the portfolio that you're tracking to another patent as a basis of rejection. And so I think that that's a very interesting piece of information. So it's pretty self-explanatory, but essentially the red ones here are there's a patent in the portfolio that's being used for a 102 rejection against the assignee that's listed on the horizontal axis. And so, Andre, I don't know if you, Melina, Janelle, anybody else has any other comments, but I just think it's just another level of granularity.
Yeah, and I think this slide is also very helpful for a patent department, communicating, broadly within the organization, another value of the portfolio. So basically, the patent group can point to this slide and go, hey, our patent filings, in addition to, building our patent portfolio is really, preventing our competitors, potentially patenting stuff that we previously invented. So it's really, putting a hurdle, in the patenting efforts of competitors, and this is it's a pretty compelling piece of information to share with the executive, saying, it really does show, a value of the patent portfolio that I don't think is often appreciated very much.
One of the things that, I'm sorry, go ahead, Janelle.
Yeah, I agree. It's pretty compelling because this in conjunction with the previous slide shows not only which companies may be drafting off of your technology in order to better themselves in the marketplace, but which companies may actually be copying your technology.
There was one other observation that came up in our preparation for this meeting that I neglected to mention, and it goes straight to the point that Andre made, is that theoretically, a defensive publication or some other informing public disclosure of your client's technology would, be available as prior art if the dates worked out right. But in practice, particularly in the United States, examiners tend to rely upon the body of prior published patent applications or patents. So the corpus of knowledge that they're using to formulate rejections doesn't really necessarily fairly include the entire body of non-patent literature. So I think that this type of reporting shows that the investment that's made in filings is not only being used to secure exclusivity for what you claim, but it makes it more likely that what you filed will be used as a basis of rejection because it's published in a patent application. So that's the only other point that I wanted to make sure to make.
All right, we go to the next slide.
Okay, so this slide shows us the patent score, and that is something, I'm not sure if the other vendors do this. This slide shows you the Anaqua patent score, and it's an automated score that they calculate based on several criteria, and you can see kind of a snip here. They look at the citations, they look at the technologies, family size, a variety of things. If you Google patent score and Anaqua or a claim IP, you'll find a page that explains in detail how they come up with the score. So this gives you an example of how you can compare the patent score for company A to company B. And Janelle, Tim, or Andre, if you can add why that might be important, that would be helpful to our audience.
So before those guys jump in there, I just want to say, so you're looking at A and B, if I understand these charts correctly, the number of patents in the far right side is, that means if you've got more on the right side of the chart, that means you've got more better patents. And if all your patents are on the left side, you've got weaker patents.
That's right.
Okay.
You can think of this like your test score. The score is out of 100. So if you're in the 90s, you got an A+, and if you're in the 20s, you probably didn't pass the class.
So company A has about 46 or 7 or 8 patents that got an A, and it's got about 15 that got an F, right? And company B only has a handful that got an A, right?
Right.
Got it. Okay, so let's go on and Andre and see if Tim has any comments.
Yeah, and again, I mean, keeping in mind the webinar is kind of focused on, automated analysis, and so this again, this is an automated score. I think the correct way to view this is more as being kind of a triage tool where, if you've got a large portfolio and you want to start analyzing those and doing the deep manual review, often a good place to start may be with the patents that got the highest score. So if you look at company A, what have they got, like 40 something, which are in the 90s. So that would be a good place to kind of start looking, to identify your top patents. So that's but as we all know, there can be one word in a claim that, renders it, of no value at all. So this obviously doesn't take that into account. So we found this to be a useful input into, if we're doing an analysis for a large number of patents and we're going to start looking at the best stuff first, it's an input that we will kind of maybe start looking at the higher value ones. And I think the thing to keep in mind here is that the patent score, and particularly this one that a claim IP does, is looks at technology, legal, and citation factors and kind of combines those into a patent score. But you can look at the legal score alone, which deals with the number of unique words in a claim and the length of the claim, and how many office actions, and how much term is left on the patent. Is it about to expire next year, or has it still got 10 years? So understanding what these scores mean can also be kind of helpful. But if we get a question from a client like, what are the top patents in our portfolio, and we haven't looked at it in a while, this would be a good place to go and run that portfolio through this tool and kind of see what spits out, and then use that as a starting point.
Yeah, that's a good point, Andre. On the example of company B, the reason that they have such a high number in the 0 bucket might be that many of their patents have expired.
Yeah, exactly. So as it moves to, it'll definitely move down that score as the patents get long in the tooth and close to expiration. Yeah. And even for an individual patent, that little chart we've got there, where it kind of shows that type of information and some kind of key metrics, is often helpful if you're reviewing a large portfolio with a large number of cases.
Okay, next slide, please.
So here, I want to, Milena, let me just interrupt. So I want to gallop through these next couple slides very quickly, so we give some time to Janelle so she can talk a little bit about watching, which was the appendage of this program, but I don't want to cut her off. So we can quickly get through these two.
Okay. Yeah, let's breeze through these. And I also have a question from the chat box about tools that I want to get to at the end. So
Okay.
this is just a sample of a report you can generate to show you the maintenance fees that are coming up on your portfolio. This is generated again from Acclaim IP, and it shows US maintenance fees by calendar quarter. So you can kind of use this to budget or to prune your portfolio. And this slide, if you are using a vendor like Black Hills Renewals, for example, you can get a dashboard that allows you to do what if scenarios. For example, if you prune your China patents, what does your renewals payments look like, and by various other tags, not shown here, but you can see there's a way you can tag this. Anyway, there's tools out there that allow you to look at the renewals and allow you to trim your portfolio accordingly, or predict your budgets in a much more data-driven way.
And I'll just throw an advertisement in for Black Hills Renewals here, that many of the analytics slides that you saw in this presentation are available for free on their analytics platform if you do your renewals with them. So instead of paying $50,000 a year, you can get a lot of that information for free if you sign up to do your renewals through Black Hills IP. So with that, let's move on and let's let Janelle take up the rest of the time here. Just do a quick intro on this. Patent watching and surveillance obviously invokes some questions about willful infringement when you're put on notice of your competitor's patents. So don't do this without consulting your attorney first. Beware that there's a lot of different opinions about this, but it could potentially cause liability for your company if you're looking at your competitor activity. Go ahead, Janelle.
Thank you, Steve. Yes, that is correct. Be careful with watching and surveillance. It can be an extremely valuable tool, but consult with your counsel concerning any programs that you set up. What is it? Watching and surveillance provide ongoing monitoring of new information concerning a patent or a portfolio of patents, such as new citations of a particular patent or portfolio by other patents, new applications filed by competitors that bear a close resemblance to your own portfolio, new developments in the prosecution of key competitor patent applications, and patents filed by ex-employees that may indicate misappropriation. In watches that I do, I also look for any changes in ownership of competitor patents, and I look at payment of maintenance fees and for applications, whether they're still alive or whether they've been abandoned, because any expiration or abandonment, of course, can make a problem disappear or not. Next slide. The value proposition for surveillance is it improves strategic and tactical awareness of the marketplace. You can obtain early indications of competitor IP or potential competitive activity. You can monitor ex-employees for compliance with non-disclosure invention assignment agreements. It can be extremely helpful there. And you can identify possible infringing technologies. I also find it extremely useful. This goes back to abandonment expiration, to watch what your competitor is doing with respect to technology that's of interest to you. And if you've got multiple competitors that you're watching, to watch what's happening in the marketplace. There are certain instances I've seen in certain technologies where everyone is working on a particular type of product because they see it as extremely beneficial for the future. And then all of a sudden, one of the big competitors suddenly lets a bunch of cases go abandoned, and other competitors may be doing something similar, do the same. What this is possibly indicative of, and this is why it's worth reviewing the specifications especially, is that, and this is especially true in the area of chemistry, is that your competitor may hit a dead end. what they thought would be a gangbuster, a blockbuster, turns out to be a complete failure. So they have to abandon entire families of cases. And if that happens, then that's a huge red flag that you should not do what they're doing, and that they're going to have to do something else. Next slide. For process and cost, client specifies the companies or individuals to watch and selects individual patents or families, and reports are generated and delivered to the client with attorney observations as desired. Next slide. Okay, and these are some of the reports that you can see. Patent family tree information can be extremely valuable for the reasons that have been previously discussed. And I look at family trees as being both horizontal and vertical. What is shown in the slide is a vertical patent family tree. That is, you have the parents, the grandparents, and the children. And it's important here to check the date of priority claims and publication dates. And horizontally, this isn't shown, but I think it's also important to look for sibling patent applications that have been filed off of these US cases. And that goes to your marketplace. If the United States is not your biggest market, if Europe is, then it's useful to know what's happening in the United States, but it's more useful to know what's happening in Europe. And the US information, you can go to certain data sources and get the corresponding international filing. And you can also look at the application data, the patent timeline as far as prosecution, and the timeline as far as issuance is concerned. Are there any questions?
Thanks, Janelle. I was going to also just observe that this was, I think, a patent bots screenshot, this last one.
Yes.
And many of the other screenshots were from Anakwa's tool today, and then some from Black Hills IP. So to give attribution to these tools, they're terrific tools to work with, and even the ones that we didn't show any output from today are also very good tools. And it just happens to be whatever tool happens to be on your desk, you're going to use that, but many of them do very similar things. So most of them do very similar things. And I guess that leaves us, Janelle, did you have more, or is that?
No, that's it. That's it for me.
And I'll just check the questions real quickly here to see if anybody had any comments. I guess not, but anyways, hey, thanks everybody for joining the program today. I want to thank the panelists, did a terrific job. You're getting there with this presentation, some of the most practical information you're ever going to get about why these are important to use. Michelle, do you want to take it from there and wrap this up, please?
Sure. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thank you to our speakers. The next episode of the Analytics How to webinar series will take place on March 25th, when we discuss how to make and use portfolio curation, competitive patent landscape, and SWOT analysis reports. You can find the registration page on the SLW Institute on the SLW website. And please keep an eye out for the email invitation as well. Thank you again for joining us, and be well.